So what I'm going to do now is go through the process of installing the Cloud Control Center. And not only am I going to install the Cloud Control Center, but I'm also going to go through the process and start configuring. So what I'm going to do is I'll open up the location of the installation files. So I'll go and access those. And you can see I've got a folder here called Cloud Control Center Installation Files. You can put them anywhere you like, it really doesn't matter. So step one is to install my Cloud Control Center. So you'll see I have an application here, SLD_X64. I'm just going to right click on that and choose Run as Administrator. The additional components that are required by the installer will automatically be installed. So I'll just click on Install and let it install those components. And you can see I've got the C++ redistributable 64-bit version and a 64-bit Java virtual machine, which the software needs as well to run. Those are installed. I can now let the system continue on with the installation process, and then I just choose Next. Pick the location where you want to install it. Again, in a hosted environment, sometimes you'll find that your system drive will be a little bit small, so you should always have a second drive, which I do. So I'll just choose Browse, and I know my second drive is actually a D drive, so I'm just going to go in here and change that to D. Then I'll say OK, I'll say Next. Now, important point to note, one of the things that you do when you've configured your Business One On-Demand installation is you will create a user that is then used for running all of the Business One On-Demand related services. In my situation, I actually create that user and I call it SAP Service B1C. So it's now going to ask what username is this, is the Cloud Control Center services going to run with. And so that's where I put this in, SAP Service B1C. And of course, you either remember the password or you've written it down. So then you put in your password and say Next. And it'll double check to make sure that's correct. Now, two things to be aware of here. You can use just standard HTTP to connect to your Cloud Control Center, or you can use HTTPS. Now, if you're not ever going to connect to the Cloud Control Center outside your environment, you don't necessarily need to use HTTPS. If you do not want to use HTTPS, then you need to have a certificate, and you need to have that in a certificate store and password. So when you click on HTTPS, it's going to ask you to browse out to where that certificate is and to also put in the certificate password. In this particular instance, we're just going to use standard HTTP, so I'll say Next. Now, my Cloud Control Center, does it have any other web applications on it or any other applications that are using port 80? In this particular situation, no, it doesn't. So I can leave the default web application as root. I can bind all of my IP addresses on this machine to that port, and I can just use the default ports, which is fine. That's all I want to do because my Cloud Control Center is a dedicated machine. Now, if by chance I've got another service that's running on this machine that's already using port 80, then I can go and click on here, and for example, I could tell this to use port 8080 if I wanted to. But in this particular instance, I don't. So I'm just going to leave it with the default ports, and then I'll say Next. Now, it's going to create my database for the storage of all the Cloud Control Center configuration, and this database is going to be called SLD model.sld data. Why SLD? Because all of these configuration sets, we actually call them system landscape directories. So that's why SLD. Now I want to use my SQL authentication, and you just put in your SA password that you created when you install the SQL server that this database is going on. And say Next. Alright, now it's going to ask you which user is going to access the Cloud Control Center. So this is when I go and load the Cloud Control Center, this is the very first and the default user. I like to create my first user and call it B1C ADM. Or you can call it B1C admin if you want. It's up to you. As long as, you could call it Rumpelstiltskin for all that matters, as long as you remember what username that you created. Alright, so it's now saying the specified username does not exist in the default domain. So it's going to want to have this user in the domain. So make sure that that user does actually exist, and then you can continue on. But now I've gone in and I've created my B1C admin in my Active Directory, so I'll say next, and you'll see I now no longer get that error message. Now I choose install, and I let the system go ahead and run. Now the Cloud Control Center is going to talk to all the other different components in your environment. It's going to need to talk to your SQL server, it's going to need to talk to your presentation server, it's going to need to talk to your domain controller, and it's also going to need to talk to the server where your files are all stored. How does it do that? It does that by using these System Landscape Directory Agents, or SLD Agent. So the next thing that you need to do is, on every server in your environment, you're going to need to go and install the SLD Agent. So now that's completed, I'll choose Finish, and the next step is, you'll see I have this directory here called the SLD Agent. So I'll go in here and I'll run the SLD Agent for the very first time on my Cloud Control Center. And then after I've done this process, I am going to need to install this agent on every other server in my environment. Now, important point to note, when you install the SLD agent, it's going to ask you what is the, it's going to ask you for a URL so it can communicate with the Cloud Control Center. So one of the first things it's going to ask you after it asks you for some of these parameters, what's the file location and everything like that. And again, in my environment, I'm going to put it on my D drive. I'll say next. It's going to ask you again, what's that username? Same scenario. All of these services have to run with this user that has to be a member of the Cloud Control Center or the Cloud Operators Group, and it has to be in your Active Directory structure. So I'll put that in, put in my password, and then I'll say next. And okay, so this is the SLD URL. So what it's asking me now is, whereabouts is my System Landscape Directory installed? So this is where you put the URL which points to a specific file which exists on your Cloud Control Center. So remember, I told the Cloud Control Center I wanted it to use HTTP. So I put http:// the name of my Cloud Control Center. So it's AGSCCC01, then /SLD/SLD.svc. So that's it. So that's the URL. So now what you can do, if you like, is you can copy that and then paste it into a notepad file, which makes it easier. Then when you're copying it onto different machines, you can just cut and paste it from the notepad file. Me, I like to do things manually, so I'm going to go and retype that every single time. So that's done. I now say install. I'll let that run. And then as soon as this is finished, I can go in and I can access my Cloud Control Center for the very first time. What I always like to do, though, as a matter of course, and I've found this after having done this installation a number of times, usually the best thing after you've done all of this is to restart your server. Why? Just to make sure that everything starts up the way it should, and just to give yourself a clean start. Occasionally I find if you don't do that the very first time you log onto your Cloud Control Center, it just won't log on. So again, for the sake of a quick restart, you don't run into any of those challenges. So let's just do that now. So I'll click Start, and then I'll choose Restart. And I'll tell it I'm doing my restart because this is application maintenance. I'll say OK, and then this is going to restart, and we'll come back in and we'll continue on with our configuration process. Now, important point to note, the only browser that we currently support with the Cloud Control Center is Firefox. So you're going to need to make sure that you have Firefox installed somewhere and a location that has access to the Cloud Control Center. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to go in, I'm going to download and install Firefox onto this particular machine. And once I've done that, I'll come back in and we'll continue on. So I've got Firefox installed now. What do I want to do? I now want to go to the URL of my Cloud Control Center. So in this case, I'm actually running on the Cloud Control Center machine itself, so I could just put in http://localhost, but I always like to get used to the machine names, so I put in the actual machine name itself, which for me in this case is AGS-CCC01, and then I hit enter. And you'll see you get your SAP Business One Cloud Control Center log-on screen. Go back to what we did earlier in the session, was we created a user to log on to the Cloud Control Center, and that was B1C admin. And then I just put in the password for that as well. Again, always a good idea to make sure you've written your password down somewhere where you can find it if you need to at a later stage. But in this case, I can remember my password. Now, if you want to, you can click here on Remember User ID, and of course, it'll just remember the B1C admin for when you log on. So now I choose Log On, and you can see here is my Cloud Control Center ready to go. So everything has worked successfully. Again, if by chance you go to do that and you click Log On and nothing happens, and it just brings you back to the log on screen again. Couple of quick things you can double check that I always find are usual mistakes that people sometimes make. Number one, make sure you restarted your server after you did the Cloud Control Center administration. Number two, make sure that the SAP Service B1C user has access to your database where you have stored the Cloud Control Center data. So that's why you always need to make sure that the SAP Service B1C user has sysadmin rights on your Cloud Control Center database. All right, those are the two most common things that will cause the Cloud Control Center not to load. And also, of course, make sure that you've opened up the port 1433 to communicate with the SQL Server. And the final thing that you also want to double check, and this is based on my own experience, make sure that the SQL Server is actually running. I remember one day sitting on the phone to support and doing a support session, and then when we got to the end of everything else, suddenly we realized, oops, the SQL Server wasn't running. Why wasn't it running? Because when I created the user, I told it for the pass, I didn't remember to set password never expires, and all of the passwords on the domain had been set for their normal 30-day renewal, so that username and password combination was no longer valid. So when the SQL Server started, it just didn't start because it wouldn't log on. So again, a couple of key things to look at. Okay, now we have our Cloud Control Center. The next thing we have to do is we have to start incorporating and registering all of our different components into the Cloud Control Center. So the first component we have to register is we have to register our database instances. So I go here to Database Instances and I click on that. Then I have to go here and I'll choose to register a database instance, and I put in the database name. So in my particular case here, it's AGS-SQL01, and then I say test connection. Now what this is trying to do is it's trying to make sure that the Cloud Control Center can communicate with this database server, and that all the components that it needs to do that communication are there. Now you'll see down the bottom, what did I get? Error while connecting to database server. I was expecting this to happen because I wanted to show you one specific aspect of this. The reason why I'm getting this error message is I have not yet installed the SLD agent on the database server. Remember, so far all I've done is install the SLD agent on my Cloud Control Center, but I mentioned it now has to be installed on every other server in my environment. So I'm going to stop the recording for a second, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to install that SLD agent, then we'll come back and continue the recording. But another quick way of double checking, where do you actually have SLD agents that are installed and running properly? If you look here on the left hand side in the Cloud Control Center, you'll see there is an option. You can click on it and it says SLD Agents, and you can see right now The only SLD agent that's installed and running correctly is the one that I've put on the Cloud Control Center. So if you've installed the SLD agent and it doesn't appear in here, then you know you've made a mistake somewhere in the SLD agent. The most common mistake when installing the SLD agent is, number one, you forget to use your SAP Servers B1C username as the username to run the service, and number two, you put in the wrong URL when it asks you. All right. So I'm now going to go and install that SLD agent on the other machines, including the SQL Server, and then we'll come back and you'll see when I go to register the SQL Server that it will work. Another point as well, if I decided to start off by registering a presentation server and that wouldn't register, same problem, missing the SLD agent. So it always checks for the SLD agent during the registration process. Again, why? To make sure that we're helping you have as seamless an installation as possible. So now you can see that those agents have all been installed on all of the different machines. So again, when we go and we look here on our SLD agents, there they are. They're all installed and ready to go. So now I'll go back up here to my database instances. I'll choose register, put in my database name, and I'll put in AGS SQL01. Now I can put in a description here. It's usually a good idea. It's a little bit like commenting your code. So you can put in first SQL Server for application usage. Alright, and then you can test the connection if you want. So if by chance you do run to this error again, what do you need to double check? Again, is our SLD agent running? Yes, we know that is. So really the only other thing that it can be is that either the SQL Server isn't running or you haven't opened up port 1433. So let's go and we'll now check our firewall port and make sure that's opened up. So I know that that wasn't opened. I've gone and opened it up. Now if I go in here and I say test connection again, you'll see I now get my little green tick telling me that I've now been able to connect to that SQL Server, and then I go and I choose register and my database instance is now registered. Alright, so there it is. My database instance on AGS SQL01, and you can see there's the description I put in. This is my first SQL Server for application usage. What's the next thing I need to do? Well, I now need to go and register my presentation server. So again, I'll choose presentation servers, go in here and say register, give it a name, again AGS RDS01, and I'll put RDS. Now in this particular instance, I know I actually have to rename my RDS server because right at the moment it's actually just called RDS01. So that's what it's going to ask me for. Now, a quick point: you need to specify here whether it's an RDS or a Citrix box. I know it's a RDS, so this will be our first presentation server, and then I'll say register. And again, that's now done. So I get my little green tick, it's done. So I'll say close, and now you can see I've got my presentation server. What else do I need to do now? Well, I now need to go and start registering some of my other components in my landscape. I need to go and I start registering my storage. So what is my storage? Let's go and take a look at that for a start. If I click on storage here in the Cloud Control Center, you'll see that there are a number of different folders that are required. I have my shared folders. I have a storage location, which is where there is a generic file storage area for each tenant. I have a user storage folder, which again is a generic user storage location for each of the individual users of the system, because they might need their own directory level file storage. I have my implementation repositories. The implementation repositories is where I can store my solution packager files. The company template repositories is where I can store backups of other SQL Server databases that I can use when I want to create a new tenant. This will become clearer when we start actually deploying some tenants. And then I have my software repositories. The Business One Cloud Control Center, in order for you to be able to push the client out, and in order for you to be able to create an SBO common, it needs to know where the SAP Business One installation files are stored. So what we're going to do is, for every version of SAP Business One that you are managing from this Cloud Control Center, you need to be able to register that location. So the first thing we have to do is we have to go and create all of those file shares. So let's do that right now. So the first one I need is my shared folder. So what do? I pick the server that I have decided to use for all of this file storage, and I'm going to connect to it. I then need to go in at the file system level to the drive where I want this folder to be, and I now need to create the folder. So this will be called shared. Next thing I need to do is I actually need to share it. So I like to use the advanced sharing option here. Share this folder, and it's going to be called shared. What are my permissions? Again, you can start getting very, very flexible with your permissions. I'll just set it for full control for the ease of use, and I'll say apply, and that's now done, and now I can say close. If I then go back and I connect to my Cloud Control Center, here's my shared folders. I now go and I say register. I put in the path of that, so my machine name, AGS shared server 01/shared, and give it a description, main folder share, and say register. Done. That's now registered. I'll say close. Next thing I now need is I need some tenant storage. Alright, let's go back to our shared server, and I'll now, underneath this, I'm going to create, well, I can create it underneath here, or I can create it at this level. I'm going to create it underneath here, so I'll say new folder, and this will be called tenants. Tenants file, tenant storage, Rumpelstiltskin, call it what you like, as long as you remember what it's called. Okay? Then we'll go back to our Cloud Control Center, and let's register that. Again, my path, AGS, shared server 01/shared/tenants. Again, give it a description, tenant storage. Register, and that's now registered. User storage, same scenario. Back to my shared folder. Create a new folder here. Call it users. Back to my Cloud Control Center, and I'm going to register it here. Now, by the way, if you can hear laughing and everything like that in the background, that's because I'm actually recording this session during a live training session with one of our partners, and there's some other training going on. So if you hear laughing occasionally in the background, it's not because people think I'm stupid, or that might actually be the case, and it's because there's other people doing training and having a good time in the background. They're doing SAP Business One training, and they're learning how to use some of our SDK components, and that's always something that's a good time to learn, so that's why you can hear the laughing. Anyway, here we go. So our path is AGS /shared/users. Again, this is my user storage, and I register that. And that's now registered. My implementation repositories. Same scenario again. Go across here. We'll create a new folder. And this one, I just call it IMP repository. Now, of course, you can go and you can just create all the folders all in one hit and then come back and register them. But I find it's a little bit easier to do this because I always forget, usually one or the other. So this way, you use this kind of like a checklist. Have I done them all? And you create them one at a time. So can I go in here, register? Alright, so that's their implementation repository. I then say register, and that's now registered, so I'll close that. Company template repository. Company templates is the name of my folder for that. Go across to my Cloud Control Center, register. Now you can have as many of these different shared folders as you like, because remember, the idea behind the Cloud Control Center is that you are creating a multi-tenanted environment. So you can break these up however you like. You can have as many shared servers as you want. You can have as many of these folder repositories as you want. And then when you create a service unit, which is a collection of resources, you can point that service unit to use any one of these different storage locations that you've created. So I'll just register, but again, you'll see that when we start creating service units and we start creating tenants and we start creating users. The next thing that I need to register, and this is an important one, is my software repository. So now, the software repository is where you store your SAP Business One files. Very important. The software repository has to have a particular file structure in it. Let's go and take a look at what that file structure is. Now, I'm going to save it on my shared server. So what do? I go in here and I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to call it Software Repository. And then underneath that, I need to have a particular folder structure. Under my software repository, what I have to do is I have to create a folder with the software version number. Now, where do you get this from? You get this from the download CD in the info.txt file. Alright? So if I'm installing patch level 11, I know that that's going to be 882.075.11. But I want to double check that. So I'm going to go off and take a quick look at where my data is currently, or my install files are currently located, which is here on this machine. I go and open up that folder, and you'll see here is my files. I'll scroll down to my info.txt, and there it is. Yes, 882.075.11. So what I can do is I can copy that if I want to, and then I'll go back to my shared machine, back to my drive, shared software repository. I can create a new folder, press Ctrl V to paste that name in, but importantly, got to get rid of that first dot. Alright, so in a directory structure in Windows, you can't have dot name, you can't have name dot name dot. It just won't recognize it. That's why we get rid of the first dot. And there we have it. And then I go in here and I now create another folder, new folder, and I'll call it Upgrade CD. Alright, so I've gone into the Software Download Center and I've downloaded the very latest update. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to open that up, and I've downloaded it onto a different server, so I'll just go in here and I'm going to extract it. So where do I want to extract it to? Well, I want to extract it to the location where I have been setting up that shared folder. So for me, that's on AGS SS01, and then I'll put /D, or actually there you go, it's already detecting it, it's going into shared. So then it goes under shared, and I'm going to put it in software repository, and then it goes underneath there, and then underneath there, upgrade CD, and then I'll say OK. And I've already copied some files in there, so I'm just going to replace all of them. So I'll just say yes to all. And now we'll let that extraction run. And then when that's finished, I'm going to come back into the Cloud Control Center, and I'm going to try to do that registration of my software repository again. So my extraction's now finished. So let's go across to the Cloud Control Center. It's been a while since I've used it, so it's logged out. I'll go and log back in again. And we're back in, so I'll go back into my storage. And now I'll go to my software repositories. Again, I'll choose register. My upgrade path is my server /shared /software repository. And again, remember, you can call it anything you like as long as you remember the name. It doesn't have to be this long, it can be short. You can make it SR or whatever the case may be. And then my version name .11, so that's my patch level 11. Alright, so I put in my path and then I choose register, and you can see now that is now done. Alright, so again, the important point to note, if you make a mistake, if you mistype something, I had mistyped the name of my directory. I called it software repository instead of repository, so when I was typing it in, it was saying that the path didn't exist. I went and renamed it, so you can see that it's going to make sure that it validates everything that you put in here. So that's it. All of my shared storage is now set up, and I have my SAP Business One software now sitting in that software repository. So the next thing I can do is I can now go ahead and I can start creating a common database for this service unit. I can then also start creating tenants. So let's go ahead and we'll do that. So the first thing I want to do now is go to Common Databases, and you'll see it says no common databases currently exist. Create a new common database. And you'll see every time I run one of these wizards, it checks to show me whether or not I actually have the prerequisites required and whether or not what I'm going to create currently exists. I've got my prerequisites, I've got a database instance and my software repository, but I don't yet have a common database. So I just tell it, which database instance do I want this to be on? Now, if I already had, let's say I had 3 or 4 SQL instances. If I clicked on that drop-down list, the instances that already have a common database registered would not appear in the list. Alright, so important point to note. Now it's also based on what I have in my software repository. I might have 2 or 3 different software repositories with 2 or 3 different versions of SAP Business One. So when I click here on version, if I had 2 or 3 different versions, it would show me which ones I had, and I would just choose them. But in this case, I've only got one, which is 075.11. So I have this one, which is going to be my SBO common for version 882, patch level 11. Again, commenting your code, put anything you like there as long as it's something which is meaningful to you. And then all you need to do is click on create. Now what you'll see happening in the background, I can click close. It's now sent a message to the SLD agent which calls a wizard from the SAP Business One installer. So if I now go down here and I look at my SLD agents, you'll see that on my triple CO1, what's happening? It's now creating my common database, and you can see where that's happening. So that way you can actually close the process, go away, log out of the Cloud Control Center, come back later. That process will still run in the background because it's the SLD agent that's doing that. Okay? But we'll just let that run for a little while, and then when it's finished it'll come back and tell us that it's done. Let's look at our SLD agents. You can now see that our operation has succeeded. So our SBO common is now created. So what's my next step? So now that we've got everything registered effectively, We've got our SBO common, we've got our presentation servers, we've got our database servers, we've set up our storage. The next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make sure that we actually have a license server installed. So we want to go and install a license server, but in order to install the license server, you have to do that manually. So our question is, on which machine do you want to install your license server? So we've decided which machine we're going to install it on. By the way, which machine are we going to install it on? The domain controller. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to log on to that machine and I'm going to install the license service. So I'll just quickly connect to it. So here is my machine. I'll connect to my location where my files are stored. And then we'll go into here, we'll go into our packages, we go into our server tools, and we run server tools. So I'll say next, give it a username, I'll just put administrator, and then I want to do a custom install of my server tools. I want to install them on my D drive again in this particular instance. And then all I want to actually install on here is the license service. So I'll say next. I've got to create a B1 site user password. So we'll just use our same password for this. And say next. It's now installing those components for me. I'll just go and double check that that's all working fine. So yes, there's our service manager. Let's open it up. We'll tell the license manager we want it to start when the operating system starts. Just going to stop it and restart it. Go and look at our settings. We'll put our license server name in. So that's our license server name. We'll set that and we'll say OK and we'll say connect. And that looks okay. The next thing I'm going to need to do though, because this is coming in on port 30,000, I need to open up my firewall on this machine. So let's go and do that now. And I'll go into my advanced settings. I'll go and create an inbound rule, and this will be ports. So I'll say next. I'm going to open up specific ports, so 30,000 and 30,001. And I'll say next. I'll allow the connection. And I'll call this my SBO license service. And I'll just put my notes here, added by Richard Duffy during training. And today is the 21st of the 3rd, 2013. And I'll say finish. So that's now done. So our license server is there. Then the next thing I'm going to need to make sure I do is I'm going to need to make sure that I configure my security. So again, go in here. This is standard Business One stuff. Put in my password and say OK. And then tell it what kind of server I've got, where that server is. Put in my DB username and my password and say add. That's now done, and that's okay. So now I'll say okay to that as well, and that's all good. Let's now go back to our Cloud Control Center and let's register our license server. So I go in here, I'll say register my server. That's my port. Test my connection. That's working. I'll say register. That's now done. So you can see right now I have a license server registered, but I have not yet applied a license file to it. So if I go here and I look at license files, you'll see that I currently don't have a license file available. So what do I need to do? I need to make sure I go to that license server, and I'll need to go through the normal process now, which is to get my hardware key and now cut the appropriate license. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now I've got that machine ID, I could go and generate a license key, and then we'll come back into the Cloud Control Center and we'll bring that license key in. So I can either bring the license key in through the Cloud Control Center, or I can bring the license key in from the service manager itself. So that's it. I've now got my license server is now configured. Next step, what I want to do is I want to create a customer. So the customer in the context of the Cloud Control Center is fundamentally a way of grouping together components. So I'm going to create a new customer, and I use the customer creation wizard. I'll say next. I want to give the customer a name. So what I'll do is I'll call this AGS Cloud Demo System. I'll put in my contact person. This is not mandatory information, by the way. Any mandatory information will usually be shown with an asterisk. As long as I put in a customer name, that's the main thing it needs. And again, you're just putting this information in for statistical purposes. We'll say next. Now what it's now giving me the ability to do is it wants me to either specify that it's a trial, or I want to bring in a license file. So I can bring in separate license files for each different customer if I want to. Because as you know, with Business One now we do support the concept of multiple license files in one license server. Or I can just skip over this because I'm not ready to do it now. So I'll just say next. Then what I'm able to do is I can say I want to add some system users for this particular customer. This process of adding users, you'll see it again a little bit later, but what I can do is I can put in a username, and then I click check name, and it will check that that user exists in the domain. So before I need to add any users into my Cloud Control Center, the user should ideally be created in the domain first. The Cloud Control Center will give you the ability to create it in Active Directory. So if I put in a username that's not in the Active Directory right now and I say check name, it'll say the user doesn't exist, do you want to add it? Personally, I like to add my users into Active Directory myself because I like to put a lot of information in there. That then becomes my storage repository for their email address and all the other values that you can put in to Active Directory. Whereas if I just add it here, it doesn't put it into all the security groups that I've selected, like my cloud users group and everything like that. So I like to do that myself. So again, I don't have to do this if I don't want to. I can just say next. I don't have to add tenants if I don't want to, because remember, with SAP Business One On Demand, what is a tenant? A tenant is fundamentally a company database. So I can have one customer who has 20 tenants because they've got 20 different company databases. Or I can have one customer, one tenant. Does that make sense? All right. So I don't want to add a tenant right now. All I'm doing in this particular instance is just creating my customer framework first. So there's all the details that I'm putting in. I'll say next and finish. It's now creating my customer. Give this a couple of seconds. And that's now created successfully. And you can now see, here is my customer. Let's say, for example, I now have another customer who's also going to be running on this system. I can now go and create them. So I'll say new, just so you can see how the concept works. Let's say I've now got, I'm going to set up a demo company, OEC Computers, Philippines. Right, that's fine for now. That's all I need to put. And this will now be done, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty tenant ready for you to do your setup from scratch. But then what I'm also going to do, I'm going to show you another way that you can deploy a tenant by getting a SQL backup of your demo database, putting it into the company template repository, and then utilizing that SQL backup to create a new tenant, because that's one of the other things that you can do. So that gives you the ability, for example, you can build all these different templates. You can say, I've got everything set up ready for a high-tech company, everything set up ready for a production or manufacturing company, everything set up for a wholesale distribution company. I have each one of those databases stored as a SQL backup, and then when I create a new tenant, I can say, you know what, this tenant is high-tech, so I will just choose to use the company template, which is a SQL backup for my high-tech customer, and then it will use that, and that will become the baseline. The other option I have is to build it in Business One and then use the solution packager to package that up into a solution package file, and I can store those as well. And when I create a tenant, as you'll see, it also gives me the option to choose a solution packager file. Alright, so that's now done. So now I've got two customers. My next step is that I now want to create a service unit. So remember, a service unit is a combination of all the different components, all the different infrastructure components that go in to make up a complete Business One on-demand deployment. Alright, so how do I do that? I go in here into my service units in my landscape management, and I say I want to create a new service unit. Now again, same scenario here. What it's doing is it's showing me all the potential components that I can use, and it's showing me whether or not I have one available. Now I haven't created an integration component yet, because remember, we haven't installed our Business One integration framework. That's okay, it's not mandatory. I'll come back, I'll create that later, and I'll add it in later. So these are all there, so I'll say next. So my service unit name, what do you want to call it? Well, I call mine by number, so I'll call this one Service Unit 1. And a service unit can only be linked to one SAP Business One version. Right, so if you have one customer who's on patch level 10, another customer who's on patch level 11, you have to have two service units. So right now I've actually only got one version of Business One available, so I only get that choice, and then I specify what is the purpose of this service unit. So this is going to be a demonstration service unit. So then I'll say next. And now it says, alright, for this service unit, these are all of the components that you can put in. The mandatory components have an asterisk next to them. The optional ones do not. So, which license server am I going to use? There's the one I've already registered. So you'll see this is the reason why we go through a specific process. Create all those options first and then put them in. then you can select them. And you'll see when I select that database instance, it already knows that I have an SBO common. Which shared folder do I now want to use? That's the one. Which tenant storage do I want to use? That's the one, and it's going to create a subfolder for this tenant automatically. What integration component do I want? You'll see, remember, I don't have any. I haven't configured the mailer service yet, so I don't have any, but I do have an implementation repository, and I do have a company template repository. So I'll say next. Now it's asking me, which RDS server do I want to use? I'll select this. Now, as soon as I commit this at the end, I've now told it that on this RDS server, I want to use Business One 8.82 patch level 11. So at the end of this process, that's when it's going to deploy the actual client from my software repository onto this presentation server. So what does that mean? One presentation server can only be used with one version of SAP Business One. So if I need multiple versions of SAP Business One, well, I'll need multiple service units and I'll need multiple presentation servers, but that's okay. And again, of course, in this world of virtualized hardware, you can create your presentation servers. If I've got a customer who's only got one user on that presentation server, then I can scale that right down. I can just say, look, give it 1 core, 4 gig of RAM, and then I've got another presentation server which might be on a different version, which might have 100 users on it. So obviously I scale that one up. Then if I need to add extra users to my first presentation server, then I can obviously scale that up, add extra cores, add extra memory, and so on and so forth. So I'll say next. And it's now saying to automatically deploy the Business One client and configure the logon account of the SAP Business One client agent, I need to enter the credentials of a cloud operator account that has administrative rights on the selected presentation servers. Remember, I've created my SAP service B1C, and it has administrative rights to the domain, therefore to any machine that is a part of that domain. So that's what I'm going to put in here. Alright, so I put that in, again my password, and I'll say OK. Alright, my format is invalid. Why? Because I don't need to put in the AGS if memory serves. Let's give it a shot, and away we go. So it's now confirming everything that I've told it, and I'll say next. It's tested the database connection, it's tested the license server connection. It's now creating the service unit, and it's deploying my SAP Business One client. So now you can see that's gone through, and our service unit is effectively created. So I now say finish, and let's go back and look at our service unit. Let's click on this particular service unit here, and you'll see it's showing me the current status. There isn't a license file available, which we know because we haven't brought that in yet because we're creating it. Common database is available, the instance is available, all of those other components are available, and when I'm looking down here, I can see each of those components. So I can scroll down and I can see that's the presentation server I'm using, that's the database instance I'm using, which storage components am I using, do I have any tenants, and at the moment I don't. No tenants running on that service unit. And again, I can look at my monitoring in here and it'll show me the current status if there are any problems or issues with any of the components in that service unit. And I can also see which of my extensions, or as you might know them, add-ons, are actually available and which ones can also then be deployed. So we now have our very first service unit. Our next step is to deploy a tenant. So let's go ahead and do that. In order to deploy a tenant, there's a couple of things I need to do first. First thing I might want to do is I might want to define some users. Okay, but that's not 100% necessary. But at least I have to have my cloud operators so I know that I can allocate cloud operators to that tenant. So I'm now going to go in here and I'll say tenant, and I'll go and I'll create a new one. Same scenario. Okay, it's going to check everything that's in place that is needed, but now I can say, how do I want to create this tenant? Do I want to create it new? So this will be just like a brand new empty Business One database. Do I want to create it from a solution packager file? Or do I want to create it from a backup file? I'm going to do a new one first. Alright, and then we're going to get a backup file. We're going to store it into our company template repository, and then we're going to create another tenant from that backup file. So let's go through this first. Now it's asking me, this tenant, which customer does it belong to? Because I can have multiple customers on one service unit as long as they're all using the same version of Business One. Okay, I'm going to put this one on my AGS Cloud demo, and then I'll say next. Which service unit is it? This is the one. How many tenants have I got on it already? None. I'll say next. Alright, now these are the kinds of fields that it's going to require when I create a normal Business One database anyway. So what this is going to do is this is going to pass all this information through into my Business One database. I'm going to call this, just for the sake of the exercise, and you can go and delete the tenant later, it doesn't matter. I'll go and call this AGS Philippines. Now, my database name. Obviously, that's not a good database name because it's too long. So I can just call it AGSPH. Okay? That's the SQL database name. What's the purpose of this? Is it productive, demo, or testing? Really, that is just to tell you so you know whether or not the customer is running in productive, demo, or testing mode. So we'll say this is just going to be for demo. What authentication type am I going to use? Use, for now, Business One Managed Authentication. Who's the contact person? Automatically picks up the contact person from the service unit, from the customer, but you can override this if you want, because you might have different contact people for each of the different tenants, because you might have one using it in the Philippines, another one in the United States, another one in China, whatever the case may be, and each one has a different one. So now you'll see it's now asking me when I create this database, which localization am I using to create this database? So you're in the Philippines, so you use the Australian localization. And then it's going to say, okay, do you want to use a default chart of accounts, or do you want to create a user-defined one? Again, same as when you create a standard company in SAP Business One. I'll say I want to use a user-defined chart of accounts, and then it's going to ask you, what base language do you want to use? Again, for you guys, you'll use, I assume, English, US. Where is it? It's probably staring me right in the face. It's probably back up here. And there it is, English United States. Do I want to give it a description? No, I'm not too worried about that right now. And then I'll say next, my format is invalid. Why? Because I've got a space there. And now I'll say next. Is that all correct? Well, actually, no, it's not, because that name is too long for the database. So I'll say next. Now it's going to ask me to set up the period information. So my period code now is 2013, but again, this is completely dependent on how you want to do your Business One period names. This is the way I always do it, but you might choose to do it differently. What are my sub periods? Well, my sub periods are months. And when does my period posting date start? So here in the Philippines, your financial year starts from the 1st of January, right? So this database will go from the 1st of January to December 31st, okay? Or whatever allowable posting dates you want, because remember, this is standard Business One functionality. And now it's going to say, okay, that's going to be your tenant. Do you now want to assign users to it? Well, yes, I do. What do I want to assign? I want to assign my operators. So I can pick my operators if I want to grant them access to it. So these are my cloud operators. But I might say, you know what? I don't want to give my cloud operators access to this. So I don't have to do that. So I'll say close. And for now, I'm just going to create the customer and not allocate any users. I'm going to come back and do that later because maybe the customer hasn't told me who the users are. So I'll say next. So that's all fine. We're now ready to go, and I'll say next. And what's happening in the background now, the system is creating the company database. It's running again a standard piece of Business One functionality to create that company database and set all those parameters, and it'll come back in a couple of seconds. It'll be done. The next step that we're going to go through is I'm going to show you how you can then create your users and grant those users access to that particular tenant. So we'll let this finish and then we'll come back. Alright, so now you can see that our tenant is now completed, and I'll say finish, and there it is. There's my particular tenant. So now that we've got our tenant created, the next step is to go online and actually try and log on as that tenant. But there's one component we haven't done yet. Now that we've deployed our SAP Business One on our presentation server, we actually have to go and publish Business One out as a remote desktop web application. So how do I do that? Very, very simple. I go back to my terminal server, my presentation server. I click on Start, go to Administration Tools, go to Remote Desktop Services, go down here to my Remote App Manager, and you'll see down here I've got one remote app that I already published yesterday as an example of Internet Explorer. So I'm just going to remove that application, and I'll say yes. And then I now want to go in and I'll say Add Remote App Programs. Opens up the Remote App Wizard. I'll say Next. It now gives me a list of programs that are installed, and there you can see there's my SAP Business One. So I click on SAP Business One, I choose Next, and I say Finish. And that's it. It's now done. So I close that down. And so if I now connect to my server, so I'll open up an Internet Explorer session, and I'll connect to our external server. And there it is. First time I'm accessing this from this particular web browser session, it's just going to ask me, will I allow the remote desktop services web access functionality? I'll say yes. And I'll say sign in. And you'll now see there is your SAP Business One application sitting there on your remote desktop services connection. Now, it's not actually showing the icon at the moment for some reason. I'm not quite sure why that is. We can go and debug that. But fundamentally, that's it. You are now ready to have your customers start connecting to this SAP Business One system. The next thing, of course, though, that you'll need to do, you'll remember, we didn't actually create any users yet. So I'm going to quickly go through and I'm going to create a couple of users, allocate those users to this tenant, and then we'll get you to try logging in as one of those users. So what are we looking at the moment? Just quickly, we're taking a look at an existing server that has been already set up. This is my, my demo farm. And what I'm showing you right now is some registry settings. Even though the Business One client has already been deployed, you then have to go and manually set these registry settings on your RDS server and also on your SQL server. So these registry settings must exist on both those machines. As a matter of fact, the easiest way to push this out and the recommended way to push this out is via a group policy object. Okay, so you can go ahead and do that if you want to. I prefer to do it manually, but I always have to go and double check what these are because I can never remember them. So here it is. It's in my HKey local machine registry hive. It's under my WoW 6432 node, Windows on Windows 64 32-bit node. Under SAP, I create a registry key called SAP Manage, and then I have to create these values underneath. A hosting key, which is a binary value, and then I actually have to create a string value as well, which is where I put in the same URL for my Cloud Control Center SLD. So let's go ahead and we'll do that now. So here we are, we're on your remote desktop server. So I'm just going to go start, run, and I'll go into regedit. I go into my HKey local machine, into my software, down here into our 6432 node, then into SAP, and what will you see? You'll see there is no key value for SAP manage, so that's the first thing I'm going to need to do. Or of course, the other thing I can do as well is I can go and I can export those registry settings from an existing registry as a .reg file, and then I can just read that .reg file. But of course I'm going to need to do that anyway for my group policy object, but I'll go in here now and I will add a new key, and it is called SAP manage. That's now there. I go in here, I create a new entry, it's a 32-bit D word. I set it to hosting, I press enter, then I go in and I set that to 1. And the next value I also need to set is a string value. So again, right click here, say new, string value, and this will be SLD address, SLD ADDRESS, and then I'll put in my value for this, which will be http:// and in my scenario here agsccc01/sld/sld.svc, and I'll say OK, and that's now done. So my registry settings are now set correctly, so I can close down my registry editor, and now all things being equal, when I run SAP Business One, either through my remote desktop server default services connection, or I run it here from the desktop icon on that server, okay, you'll now see it does not give me the option to specify a company. But now I'm getting error while logging on. Why? Because this user has not yet been created inside the tenant. So there's no users for the tenant, so by definition it's saying, well, how can you log on if there's no users? Alright, so that's all fine, but you can now see those registry settings have kicked in. So the next thing I have to do is I'll have to go back into my Cloud Control Center, and I'll have to start creating the users. But what do I have to do first, or what do I like to do first? I like to go into the domain controller, and I like to create the users on the domain controller first. So let's go and do that. So here's my domain controller. So I go in to my Active Directory users and computers, and I'll go in here and I'll create a new user. So I'll say new user, and let's say I'm going to create Edward. So I'm going to create a user called Edward. Now, one of the things that I always like to do is make sure my usernames are less than 8 characters. Matter of fact, you should always make sure they're less than 8 characters, because it just makes it easier for everybody. And Business One likes usernames that are less than 8 characters. But you can map a Windows username that's greater than 8 characters, and when you create that user in Business One, you can say, you know what? In the Cloud Control Center, when I create this username, I want it to be smaller. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we're okay with that. And then we want to untick the user must change password at next login. And I'm going to right now say the user cannot change password and password never expires. But when you're creating your security, you can create an option on your remote desktop that gives, or on your remote desktop web, your user portal, that gives the user the ability to change their own password. So you just add a couple of extra settings, and then they can open up a password change page, and change their own passwords. But for now, we're not going to give them that ability. So I'll go in here and I will put in a password, and I'll just make one up, and then I'll say next. Of course, when I do this, I want to communicate to the user what is the password I've created for them as a default. So I'll now say finish. Now, again, what do I have to double check? You'll see that the password I've just created for this user does not meet the complexity requirements. So whatever policies you set up in your Windows environment will be reinforced here, because all I'm doing right now is just standard Windows functionality. So I didn't include a non-alphanumeric character. Now I've done that, you'll see that it now allows me to add that user. Next thing I want to do is I want to add this user to my group, and you are going to be a member of my cloud users group. So I'll put you in there. That's now done. And now that that's done, I can go back to my Cloud Control Center and we'll log on. And I will just do a refresh on this. Alright, so that's now just redrawn the screen. It's in the middle again. So now that I've created the user in Active Directory, what am I going to need to do? I'm going to need to go to the customer. And then under my customer, I have to create the user under the customer. So I'll say add. Now it asks me what's my domain username. So I put in the username that I just created. And I'll say check name. It validates that that user is active in the domain. And then I can say save.